Hi everybody, this is Miss Dewey, and today we are going to talk about the evidence for evolution. Before we can start to talk about the evidence for evolution though, we should first describe what evolution actually is. So evolution is a scientific theory, and it states that all living things on Earth share a common ancestor and that species change and diversify over time. This means that we all started off coming from the same single-celled organism a very long time ago. And then over time, different species evolved different adaptations for their environment that allowed them to survive better. We'll talk more about the process of that, natural selection, next week. But for today, just know all living things share a common ancestor and species change over time. But first, let's talk about what a theory is. Because a lot of people, they hear the word theory and they think, oh, that's like a educated guess. But in science, theory is actually an explanation that has been repeatedly tested and backed up by evidence. So you can't call something that is just a guess a theory. If you are going to call something a theory in science, it has to be backed up by testing over and over and over again, like the theory of gravity, the theory of atoms, or the theory of evolution. So if evolution has been tested over and over again, it must have a ton of evidence, right? Oh, it definitely does. There is a lot of evidence for evolution, including, but not limited to, fossil evidence, anatomical evidence, biogeographical evidence, embryonic evidence, and molecular evidence. So those are the 5 types of evidence that we're going to talk about today. The first of those is fossil evidence. So what even are fossils? Fossils are the remains of living organisms that have been preserved in rock. So a very long time ago, something died. It got buried under a bunch of silt and sand. But luckily for us, that meant that those bones got trapped in the rock and preserved, meaning that even though that animal lived millions and millions of years ago, we can see it now. Dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, but because of fossils, we know what they looked like, and we can even try and figure out what they acted like. So before we get into the fossil evidence for evolution specifically, let's talk about what fossils have shown us about the story of life on Earth. So because of fossil evidence and just general geological evidence, we know that the Earth was made 4.5 billion years ago. 4 billion years ago, about 500 million years later, we see the first life on Earth. So for 500 million years, there was no life on Earth. It was a horrible place to live, lots of volcanoes, lots of lava, very ugly. But even when we got our first life on Earth, it was very simple life. It was single-celled organisms, prokaryotes, basically just a bunch of bacteria floating around in the ocean. It isn't until 2.7 billion years ago, over 1 billion years later, that we even see our first eukaryotes. We're still not even talking multicelled organisms. We're just talking about cells that have a few more organelles inside of them. This is also when we see specifically the evolution of the mitochondria and the chloroplast, which are really cool topics, and if you have the time to look into them, I definitely recommend it. But even still, we don't see actual multicelled organisms until 2 billion years later. 600 million years ago, we finally get our first multicellular organisms. So we finally get the first life on Earth that you don't need to look under a microscope to see. And even then, everything up until this point lives in the water, and it isn't for another 200 million years, 400 million years ago, that we get our first land animals. 230 million years ago, we get our first dinosaurs. I know that dinosaurs are sort of the one big fossil that most people know about. We see our first dinosaurs 230 million years ago, and they die out 75 million years ago. So dinosaurs were around for over 100 million years until they finally went extinct. Humans, we only appeared 200,000 years ago. So 200,000 years on our scale is a very, very long time ago. But when it comes to geological time, that's like the blink of an eye. We've barely been here at all. So overall, what these fossils show us is that life has constantly been changing. We started out with very simple organisms, but now we're here with organisms that are multicellular. They've got complicated organelles. They live on land. We have humans who are walking upright. That wasn't the case earlier on in geological time. So that shows that overall some change must have happened. More specifically, we sometimes find things called transitional fossils. Transitional fossils show us specifically how one type of organism transitions into another. So one of my favorite transitional fossils is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is a fossil that has a lot of traits that are like a bird and a lot of traits that are like a dinosaur. So Archaeopteryx actually shows us how dinosaurs evolved into birds. So if you want something cool to tell your family today, you can point at a bird outside the window and say, "Hey, I saw a dinosaur today," because birds are dinosaurs. And Archaeopteryx is one of the things that showed us that. So next on our list of evidence is anatomical evidence. There are two big pieces of anatomical evidence that we use as evidence for evolution. The first are homologous structures. Some organisms look very different, but when you actually look at their bones, look at those underlying structures, you'll see that they're very similar. One of the best examples of this is looking at a human arm and a whale fin. So human arms and whale fins do very different things. They look very different. They're very different sizes. But when you actually look at the bones underneath, you can see that both humans and whales have 5 fingers, and then there's 2 long bones connected to those fingers, and then there's 1 long bone connected on top of that. So that is an underlying structure that you see in both humans and whales, which shows that they must have had a common ancestor that at some point passed down that structure. And in fact, we see that structure in a ton of different animals. You see the same structure in bats, you see the same structure in dogs, you see the same structure in birds. And that's all because we came from that common ancestor and we inherited that pattern of 5 fingers, 2 bones, 1 bone. The other type of anatomical evidence is vestigial structures. So some organisms have these unnecessary body parts or body functions because at one point that part was really important to an ancestor. So it's still on their body even though they don't use it because it hasn't quite evolved out yet. Again, we call these unnecessary parts vestigial structures. Another really good example of this comes from whales. So whales actually have vestigial hips. That's because a very long time ago, whale ancestors walked on 4 legs. So they had a pair of back legs. But as they transitioned into the water, they didn't really need those back legs anymore. They only needed their tail and the front flippers. So those back legs became smaller and smaller and smaller. And now they're at where they are today, where they have these hips that haven't evolved away yet, but they still have them. So after that, we have biogeographical evidence, which is studying the biology of organisms in relation to their geographical location, make hypotheses about evolution and geology. So it's not like all of these things evolved in a test tube and then just appeared in the world. All of these things evolved in specific places, in specific environments. So if you look at how different organisms are scattered across the globe, we can often learn things about how they evolved. So for instance, if we look at the Americas, we can see that there are armadillos in the Americas. We don't see armadillos anywhere else on the globe. And if we also look at the fossil record of South America, we will see fossil armadillos there that we don't see anywhere else in the world. So this tells us, okay, armadillos must have evolved in South America. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. They got their start in South America, and so that's why they're still there today. Our next step on the tour of evidence of evolution is embryology. Embryos are the middle stage between a fertilized egg and a fully formed baby. And embryos of different species all begin looking almost identical. So again, we all came from a common ancestor. We're all sort of made of the same stuff. So that means that our babies, when they're starting to form, all start out looking the same. And then they start to differentiate. They start to branch out and gain traits that make them look more like their adult selves. But the interesting thing about embryos is that they also mimic evolution in a way. So for instance, human embryos for a time will have gills and a tail because at one point our ancient ancestors were fish who also had gills and a tail. And our final piece of evidence for evolution is molecular evidence. Here we're really talking about genetic codes and also proteins because remember, our genetic code codes for our proteins. So these two are very closely linked. So just like you share a lot of your genes with your family members, humans as a species share a lot of genes with our close relatives. So we actually share 98.8% of our genes with chimpanzees, who are our closest relatives. So a really common way of determining how closely related different species are is to actually check the number of DNA sequences and amino acid sequences that are the same between them. The more similar they are, the more closely related they must be. So just to sum everything up, evolution is a scientific theory that states that all living things share a common ancestor, and that species diversify and change over millions and millions of years. The evidence that we have to show that evolution happened is fossil evidence, with transitional fossils included, anatomical evidence, specifically vestigial structures and homologous structures. We also have biogeographical evidence looking at where species are placed to tell us about their evolution, embryology, and finally, molecular evidence. So next week, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how things evolve, not just how we know that things evolved. We'll learn a little bit about natural selection and speciation. But for now, let me know if you have any questions about evolution as a whole or about the evidence that supports it. I hope that you have a great week and stay safe, everybody.